Hey, real estate nerds, this is Alex Yoder with Pro Tip Tuesday, my favorite day of the week. And today I want to talk about a question that seems to come up pretty often that landlords are asking: how much notice do I need to give to my tenants that I am increasing the rent? So there isn't technically a required notice period. However, the tenant has to agree to the increase, or, if you are raising the rent, they have to agree to it. So theoretically, I could give them 5 days and, hey, your lease starting here in 5 days at the beginning of the next month is going to be $20 more. And if they agree to it, you're fine. But there is no time period that you have to give tenants in terms of what their increase will be. However, again, you cannot raise it unless they agree to it. So let's say you propose that 5 days out, and the tenant says, I can't afford $20 more per month, so I'm not going to agree to that. Now you may be in a position to where either you are backing down and agreeing to just keep the rent the same, or maybe your taxes and insurance went up so much that you have to raise the rent and you can't afford to not raise the rent to cover those costs. So now maybe you have to non-renew the tenant and basically say, hey, you're going to have to vacate because I can't afford to not raise the rent. And if you're in that situation, you're going to have to give a notice of non-renewal. And then that leads into the bill 1098 that passed last year, which basically restricts the reasons for which a landlord can non-renew and gives a longer non-renewal notice period. So you can look at one of my previous videos, but basically there's 6 reasons, and one of those reasons is a tenant's refusal or failure to sign the proposed renewal. And so if you're in a situation where you are raising the rent, maybe it's the beginning of the next month, you're going to want to provide that lease ASAP, and then you'll want to consult with your legal counsel to see what a reasonable amount of time is to give the tenant time to review that lease, that proposed increase in that new term, and to either sign or turn it down. What I've heard from most attorneys is 10 to 14 days is probably reasonable. But then if they don't sign within that reasonable amount of time, you could non-renew for failure to sign. Now, keep in mind that 1098 only applies to lease terms or occupancy periods that are 12 months or more. That's a little bit gray. So again, what does that exactly mean? Could that be 11 months and a couple days, or does that actually mean 12 plus months only? Another good question for your attorneys, because some attorneys are interpreting that differently. But generally speaking, let's say it's a new tenant, they just moved in 6 months ago, they had a 6-month lease, you're off the hook. In most cases, you're going to give a 30-day notice of non-renewal. There are some exemptions to that as well, but typically you're going to give around 30-day notice of non-renewal. If it's an exempt property, it's not part of 1098. If it's definitely part of 1098 and it's a 12-month occupancy period or lease, now you're going to have to give, in many cases, a 90-day notice of non-renewal. Particularly if you are non-renewing for failure to sign, it's always going to be a 90-day notice. If it's a 12-plus month lease property that's covered under 1098. So it is pretty confusing, but generally the advice is that you give tenants as much notice as possible. And many of us are reaching out, 3 to 4 months out, so that we can give tenants the opportunity to know what their rent increase is going to be pretty early. And then we have much more time to non-renew with that 90 days. Now, that 90 days could bleed past the end of their existing lease. So it's not a huge deal necessarily that you're jumping on it early. Just know that you might be in a situation where, they're not going to agree to a rent increase in 5 days. And you can't afford, like I said, to not get an increase. And so now you're giving a 90-day notice for 3+ months out, and that may or may not be problematic. It is problematic, and if that 90 days is falling on November 30th or something, because that's a pretty unfavorable time to have an occupancy right there in the middle of the holidays. So that's one example of why it could be problematic. So anyway, in general, give tenants as much notice as possible. There is no technical requirement for how much time you need to give a tenant on an increase, But if they don't agree, you're going to be in a situation where you're either backing down, negotiating something else, or non-renewing the tenant. And there's a lot of provisions and regulations around the non-renewal of tenants now in Colorado. Hopefully that's helpful. We'll see you next week.